Los Angeles, City of Angels, now on fire. The scene of the first major reckoning of President Trump's second term. 3 days of protests as people march against the government's policies on immigration. Increasingly violent scenes with both sides blaming the other. The White House accused protesters of using violent tactics. Critics said Trump's shocking deployment of the National Guard is simply because he wants to create chaos and division.
Y'all told us to come here for opportunity. We came, and then now it's like, oh, you have to leave. But when I was the working class, y'all loved me, right? But now that we're too many people, what's the issue?
With pockets of demonstrations flaring up over the weekend and incidents of clashes between protesters and police, Trump called in members of California's National Guard. But protesters believe their presence and use of tear gas and flashbang grenades is only inflaming a tense situation, with an Australian reporter struck by a rubber bullet while covering the demonstration.
You okay?
Protesters took over and stopped traffic on the 101 freeway, with some throwing objects at officers who had to take cover. With cars set alight later on, Trump and his supporters said this warranted his actions, with some claiming that because people were waving the Mexican flag, that Los Angeles was now, quote, occupied territory. Trump was asked about the weekend's protests on Sunday.
We're going to be watching it very closely, and when they spit at people, you know, they spit, that's their new thing, they spit, and worse, you know what they throw at them, right? And when that happens, I have a little statement, they say, they spit, we hit. And I told them, nobody's going to spit on our police officers. Nobody's going to spit on our military.
It was on Friday that people began to protest after immigration raids in parts of LA, with people put in unmarked vehicles and then driven away in convoys, with military protection also on hand. Crowds began to form and some people tried to stop the vehicles. Protesters marched on a federal building in downtown LA where it was believed many of those detained were being held. ICE have said that their operations in LA this week resulted in the arrest of 118 so-called aliens. That's people who are not legal residents of the USA. For Trump and Republicans, this is what he won the election on, a hardline stance on immigration from the government. For the people of LA, they say this should be a sanctuary city where they are protected by the state of California.
I think that's honestly like what's heartbreaking the most, because they're making it seem like they're really bad people, like criminals, and when they're not, when they're just trying to work hard for their own families.
This is not helping the city. It's actually damaging its wages, because there's a lot of taxes that are paid by undocumented people.
Protesters began clashing with riot police outside the detention center, and this is when the first skirmishes began. With Trump then calling in the National Guard, come Sunday, the crowds outside were now larger, the line of troops and officers bigger too.
They have all the guns. We know they have all the guns. We gotta let people know that we have a right to speak up. We're supposedly in a democracy and have a voice, but we've got to heighten that voice.
The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, called for protesters to remain peaceful, while Senator Adam Schiff said that any violence would only play directly into the hands of those who seek to antagonize and weaponize the situation for their own gain. Words also repeated by the mayor of LA.
But the most important thing right now is that our city be peaceful. And so protests and expressing your, fears, your beliefs, is appropriate to do, but it is just not appropriate for there to be violence. And I don't want people to fall into the chaos that I believe is being created by the administration completely unnecessarily.
While many Democrats criticized President Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard despite not being asked by local or state authorities, the LA police chief said on Sunday that due to recent violence, perhaps the help may be needed after all.
Do we need them? Well, looking at it tonight, this thing has gotten out of control. Looking at the violence tonight, I think we got to make a reassessment.
Usually the National Guard is deployed at the request of the state governor. That was the case back in LA in 1992 after widespread violence and looting. Then President George H.W. Bush sent soldiers and Marines out onto the streets to restore calm and order after the Rodney King riots. The last time a president deployed troops without being asked by state officials was back in 1965, when President Lyndon B. Johnson used the National Guard to protect civil rights protesters during their march from Selma to Montgomery in the Deep South. Many critics believe Trump's actions are partly about his ongoing feud with Governor Newsom. The pair first clashed over wildfires in California in 2018 and then earlier this year. Newsom is a Democrat who's seen as a future presidential contender. But also, this is about a president who has long sought to suppress protesters and label them as violent leftist radicals. Back in 2020, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, Trump deployed troops to fire tear gas at protesters outside the White House so he could stage this infamous photo opportunity. Trump critics will say this is the opportunity he has been waiting for, to say that Democrats cannot control their cities, that only he is addressing the issue of illegal immigration, and that perhaps he can really push executive powers, even invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to use the military on US soil, a rarely used move.
On California, are you prepared to invoke the Insurrection Act?
Depends on whether or not there's an insurrection.
There is, sir?
No, but you have violent people, and we're not going to let them get away with it.
And if you're not planning to invoke the Insurrection Act, you still plan to send troops?
Well, we're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country. We're not going to let our country be torn apart like it was under Biden and his auto pen.
What is the bar for sending Marines to
The bar is what I think it is. I mean, if we see danger to our country and to our citizens, we'll be very, very strong in terms of law and order. It's about law and order.
Sending active duty Marines on the table, sir. Secretary has
We're going to see what we need. We'll send whatever we need to make sure there's law and order.
While Trump has ruled out the Insurrection Act for now, the week ahead will be crucial. 200 National Guard troops have been deployed so far, but Governor Newsom has formally requested that the Trump administration put the troops back under the state's command. He said Donald Trump needs to pull back. He needs to stand down.
Rescind this order. It's illegal and unconstitutional. And I said it, I'll say it again, it's immoral. You're creating the conditions that you claim you're solving, and you're not. And you're putting real people's lives at risk. This is a serious moment, and it requires serious leadership.
Whether he will remains to be seen, especially given just after midnight, Trump wrote on Truth Social, "Bring in the troops."
I'm joined now by Greg Swenson from Republicans Abroad. Greg, is this democratic, calling in the National Guard?
Oh, absolutely. I think what's not democratic is not protecting your citizens. I'm really kind of shocked at Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass for sitting on their hands and letting these protests turn into riots, and what they call peaceful protests turn into a picture of burning vehicles and violence and property destruction. So yeah, I think it's quite democratic for the president to make that decision.
But it's very unusual, isn't it, calling in the National Guard for such a small protest in comparison to ones in the past, and doing it without the governor's say-so?
Yeah, look, I think there's no such thing as a small protest if it's violent. If it's peaceful protest, great. I think in many ways what the government's trying to do, the federal government, is protect the right to peaceful protest, which isn't really possible if people are rioting and burning cars and attacking law enforcement officials. So I think in this case, he let it go for a few days, but when things got out of hand, he felt he had to act. And I think most Americans will support that.
But isn't that the issue? He's been accused of flaring things up by bringing in the National Guard rather than taming things down.
Yeah, I think it takes some brave behavior, some brave decision making. We saw this with President Eisenhower. We saw it with President Kennedy and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, when he was Attorney General, sending National Guard, sending federal troops to make sure that African-American children could go to school. And I think that was very brave of them to do against a great pushback from the Southern Democrats at the time. So I think this is a moment where the alternative would be doing nothing and letting these mostly foreign agitators, foreign protesters, or illegal migrants, destroy American property and threaten American lives. So I think this is a no-brainer.
Do you think this sets a precedent now that any protest that goes on for numerous days, that the National Guard will be called in then?
No, not at all. In fact, again, it's protecting the right to protest. But the right to protest is not to have outside agitators, especially if they're illegal migrants. They've already committed crimes. This is something that I don't think most citizens would want to tolerate in their city.
But why couldn't this have been dealt with by local police? This isn't beyond the powers of local police. This is the National Guard. This is a big deal.
That's right, Anya. It's a great question, and it's a great point. And what happened is the local police were unable to manage it, and they didn't get support from the governor or the mayor. So the local police couldn't handle it. And of course, the local authorities, at the direction of the mayor and the governor, are not cooperating with ICE, which is the Immigration Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So on one hand, the local police cannot handle it because the government has let these protests get so out of hand. And on the other hand, they're not cooperating with ICE. And I think that's the real tragedy here is you have local governments that have decided they want to make their states and cities so-called sanctuary cities or sanctuary states where they deliberately will not cooperate with federal authorities. And the federal government is tasked with protecting the borders. That's their responsibility. And they're not getting any cooperation. So, this is something that no president wants to do at all. But I do think that there is a real problem here. You see a lot of Mexican flags in the area. You don't see a lot of American flags. So in many ways,
what's wrong with showing a Mexican flag?
Nothing at all. In fact, that's perfectly respectful if it's respectful. But in this case, it's Mexican flags that are being flown while they're burning cars. And so it's important to make that distinction.
Greg Swenson, thank you very much.
Thanks, Anya.